This is Frank Islam, Chairman and CEO of our investment group, and your host of Washington Calling, where we interview leading voices from business and politics that impact you, the viewer. Today, we are fortunate to have a distinguished guest who's also a dear friend of mine, and my wife, Debbie. And her name is Sushma Raman. She's the Executive Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She's a currently member of RF Kennedy Human Rights. She co-authored a book, The Coming Good Society, Why New Realities Command New Rights. So thank you, Sushma, for coming to our show. We deeply appreciate you taking the time to connect and to interview us. So we get started in a minute. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Frank, for inviting me. It's such an honor and privilege to know you and to follow your leadership in business, technology, politics, philanthropy, global affairs, and
that's
very
what we're
much.
going to ask that question. Thank you, Sushma. Your kind word, your thoughtful word. I'm touched by your grace. As we understand, you have been involved, engaged in many activities such as economic and social justice, press freedom, human rights, and philanthropy. What triggered you to take up these issues? Please tell us your views and vision on these challenges. As you know, your engagement in these areas are the pillars of our democracy. I'll be interested in your thoughts. How do we create and sustain the strong freedom of press and human rights culture in this world and United States and abroad? Go ahead, Sushma.
So that's a very big question, Frank. We could spend the full hour on this. Before I start, I'll say that, I'm just reflecting my own personal thoughts and views, not necessarily the views of any employers, past or present. As you're aware, I was born and raised in India, and those years were very formative for me in terms of shaping my approach and thinking around social justice and economic justice concerns. So I was very interested in matters of migration and refugees, viewing Tibetan refugees, interested in matters of gender justice, looking at the status of women and girl children in India, and also broader issues of economic equity and access for millions of people who do not have access to basic things that the rest of us take for granted. And then I came to college in the United States, where I got involved in more global issues of concern. At the time, thinking about human rights and peace in Central America, a transition from apartheid to a post-apartheid South Africa, and issues of racial and social justice in the United States, which were not known to me prior to my coming to the United States. So these were some of my formative experiences, and I'm a bit of a generalist. I've worked in a range of organizations, different sizes, different causes, and I think that has helped me hone an appreciation for domestic and global issues, as well as the interconnectedness between many of the challenges that face societies today.
Please tell us about your book, The Coming Good Society, which you co-authored. What are the book's guiding principles? Please tell us why you wrote this book. And by the way, can you tell us if it's available at Amazon?
So here's a copy of the book.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful. I like the cover. That's fantastic.
Yes. Harvard University Press has published it. My co-author is Bill Schultz, who is the former executive director of Amnesty International USA, and who's really a senior figure in a range of sort of social causes. And we thought of writing this book because we felt that oftentimes people who are thinking about human rights are mired in today's crisis or today's humanitarian intervention. And we don't often look at the horizon to say, what are the issues upon the horizon that we need to address in order to be more effective, relevant, and impactful? In any field, for example, in business and technology, we will look to the horizon and say, what is on the horizon? And so we wanted to bring that lens to the work. And we saw that a range of scientific and technological advancements, as well as norm changes, are taking place, which affect human rights access and which affect how we realize our rights.
Very well.
And we are now living in a world where authoritarians around the world are muzzling rights, muzzling freedom of speech, attacking rights defenders. And so then the question becomes, does it make sense to really think about a broader expansion of rights at a time when core rights are under attack? And we say, yes, it makes sense to do both. Defend the core rights that are under attack, but also think about how to make the rights framework more relevant, more impactful, and more connective with the challenges on the horizon. So we don't pretend to answer all of the questions at stake, but we take on a few different issues that we think are important, such as how do we reconceptualize a right to privacy in an era of surveillance technology where our data is commodified and sold, as well as when governments are using very sophisticated private technology to track our every move? How do we think about a right to health in a world where many people are dying from diseases that in other countries they are not experiencing, but at the same time, gene editing and other forms of advanced biotechnologies could affect the right to health for generations to come?
Very well said. This gives me a segue to talk about you're executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard University, and you firmly and strongly believe in respect for human rights. Please tell our audience, do you think the human rights organizations across the world are being allowed to play the role they need to play? Can you shed some bright lights on which country in the world have human rights abuses that are deeply concerning and alarming? And also, do you think the human rights we have because we exist as a human being? Then universal rights are inherent to us, regardless of who we are, our nationality, our color, our creed, religion, race, and belief, and background. Human right is the cornerstone of international human rights law. Can you shed some light on it?
Yes, so I do think that human rights organizations have played an important role and are playing an important role. And I include both the formal organizations as well as the more informal grassroots organizations and social movements that are mobilizing around issues such as, for example, economic rights and justice, treatment of women, indigenous communities and preservation of the environment, the harms of globalization, and so on. And these groups connect both locally as well as globally in very sophisticated ways. And in the digital age, we've seen the rise of network movements where people connect using digital means to advance certain causes. Now, there are definitely attacks occurring on human rights organizations, but also on journalists, on anti-corruption activists, on democracy activists, on those who are trying to hold government accountable. And this is happening around the world. We see this phenomenon that is called closing civic space, where governments either by laws or legislation, policies, or even just practice reduce the ability of people to express their views freely, to assemble freely, to criticize governments. We've seen them arrest people on false pretexts, shut down their organizations. And very often in the post 9/11 world, anti-terrorism is used as a pretext for shutting down the views of people who are trying to hold government accountable. In the past year and a half, we've seen the pandemic used as an excuse to really roll back freedoms of assembly, expression, and association around the world. And you asked which countries, and I will say, we need to be vigilant about the countries that we might think are alarming, but we also need to be vigilant about what is happening in so-called democracies.
Right.
So, for example, we may be concerned about what's happening in North Korea or Russia or China with the treatment of Uyghurs, but we may also think about places where there are elections countries like Brazil or India or the United States or many countries in Europe
Or
and
Hungary,
say, Hungary, definitely. And how are these rights being rolled back and what can we do? And I think what we really need to do is think about respect for civic freedoms, freedom of expression, association, democratic freedoms, but also thinking about tackling economic inequality and corruption and how to provide a fairer opportunities for the majority of the world who are often excluded from economic access.
So Sushma, you have worked on a project supporting immigrants and refugee rights. I'm sure you know the burning and international issues in countries such as Syria, Afghanistan, and you mentioned China. What do you think should be the roles and the responsibilities of UN and other major world powers? Do you think the world powers are taking the responsibility seriously on refugee crisis? And I also want to talk about the immigration. Do you believe the migrants are the building block of creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship? They create jobs, build prosperity. As President Kennedy once observed in his book, immigrants infuse this nation with far horizons and new frontier, thereby keeping the hope alive and well. And he should know because he was the grandson of an Irish immigrant. And his ancestors came during the potato famine from Ireland to the United States. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we are now witnessing really the largest number of people on the move since the Second World War. And many of the institutions, laws, covenants, treaties, policies were really set up in that post-war context. And currently, according to UNHCR, 2 out of 3 refugees originate from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar. Mm-hmm. And contrary to the perception that the US, Western Europe bear the brunt of refugees, the reality is the majority are hosted in countries in the global South, so countries that are adjacent. But these data points do not reflect the fact that many people are internally displaced. They are displaced within countries because of conflict or drought or other circumstances. They don't even have the resources to cross a border. And in many cases, people are fleeing, but they do not meet the definition of a refugee. For example, if you are fleeing, let's say, gang violence or domestic violence, you may not always meet that criteria of political persecution. So the reality is the landscape is very complex, far more complex than it was 70 years ago. And we have a patchwork of domestic laws and policies that are not always aligned, and that, and the larger institutions are not always equipped to deal with these changing realities. So I do think that we are in a challenging phase where many countries have nationalist governments and also populations that are anti-immigrant, that elected officials feed off of, and sort of there's this sort of revolving cycle of anti-immigrant xenophobia that occurs. And that makes it challenging to really think about how global organizations that really are the meeting of these national governments, how can they best respond? But I do think we need to think about migration in a different frame, as opposed to one of liabilities, but rather one of assets. And that's exactly what you are talking about.
That's very well said.
We need to address the root drivers of displacement, because there are many instances where people do not want to migrate. So how do we address displacement due to environmental degradation or conflict or war, other types of issues that are forcing people to flee, while at the same time creating rights-respecting regimes to welcome newcomers?
Very well said. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the power of purposeful philanthropy, which I gave several speeches on this topic. Do you believe the investment in philanthropy create a difference that matters to future society? Do you also believe that the fruits of philanthropy are reaching the intended beneficiary in various regions, especially South Asia, for good causes? I would like you to think about a quotation from President Kennedy, because you work for the Kennedy School of Government: to whom much is given, much is expected. Do you think the philanthropists are committed to the welfare of community, and are they making a meaningful and profound difference in people's lives?
Yeah, this is a terrific question, a complicated one. And I've had the privilege of working at two large, well-established and well-respected foundations, the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Foundation. And I learned incredibly from those experiences and believe that a lot of the work that we were supporting at the time made a difference. I think that private philanthropy can play an important role in supporting efforts that governments either cannot fulfill or will not fulfill, or maybe should not fulfill. In fact, I think the role of civil society is sometimes to play a countervailing role to state power, and philanthropy plays a role in supporting these civil society efforts. I also think in many areas, philanthropy can provide seed funding for new ideas that then might take off and then might be proven and then could go to scale with public funding or other kinds of funding. So I think that's a very important role that philanthropy can play and does play. There are definitely institutional challenges with philanthropy because of the power imbalances that occur between large donors with significant power and resources and smaller organizations that are seeking financial support. And the challenge becomes finding that balance between seeking funding but not derailing your agenda in order to seek philanthropic resources. I think another challenge becomes identifying ways to resource that are important, but where philanthropy maybe has not yet seen that to be important, right? Like there's a gap in the market between what is needed and then what is supplied. But I do think that philanthropy, by being more reflecting, humble, listening to recipients and grantees, can play an important role in supporting these efforts. Is it reaching beneficiaries? Again, I think that's hard to tell. I think that depends on an individual organization by organization analysis. But I also think that there are some misconceptions that often occur in people outside of this work, which say like, we should not fund overhead. We should put all the money into supporting people. And that becomes challenging because institutions need to pay their staff to get work done. You need the infrastructure to make things happen, and we need to plan ahead. One other thing I think philanthropy needs to do is not just be focused on the issue of the day and then switch to something else tomorrow, because social change takes a long time and they need to listen to what is happening in the ground in order to be effective.
Very well said. So I want to change the little bit the gears and talk about the secret of your communication skills. What advice do you have for the younger generation in sharpening their skills in communication so they can have a career successful career? And what do you think are the communication skills that you believe in? For example, confidence, sharing feedback, volume and clarity, empathy, respect, listening and learning. Those are the skills that I have taught, that I share with you. Those are the communication skills that I would like to have, but I do not know how to use that skill and hone in to help and support others, especially the younger generation.
That's also a big question, Frank. And I think I'm really a lifelong learner. I define myself as a learner. Yeah. So I see myself as a learner. I think the most important thing perhaps is listening, because in order to communicate with others, we often focus on how we speak and what we want to convey. Particularly if you're involved in social change causes, there needs to be a dialogue. So we need to think about the other party. What are they trying to communicate? What are their priorities and interests in order to shape one's own messages? But in terms of tips, I might say, I came to writing a little later in my career. I think that I had a lot of work experience, and it's only more recently that I've begun thinking about writing. So something as simple as keeping a journal if you have an amazing job, right? Like I have visited so many amazing groups, and from Haiti to Bolivia to, Bangladesh. And I think I never kept a journal of my travels, my meetings with amazing leaders. So of the work, the things you've learned, I think is really, really important. Finding ways to write and publish is also another way to build one's communications platform. And then I would also add reading, because there is so much knowledge out there from prior generations, but also people currently working in the field and in academia. So by building one's knowledge base and understanding the field in which we're working better, we can become better communicators.
Very well said. I'll ask you the final question before we depart. What are your thoughts on the success of Indian Americans like yourself and me across several areas, including politics, public life, entrepreneurship, and arts and culture? Do you believe the Indian diaspora can be the vital resource for India, as they can substantially contribute in the areas of innovations, entrepreneurship, education, arts, culture, skill development, and job training, and poverty alleviations in India? Do you think they're uniquely positioned to keep India and make sure India can achieve its fullest potentials?
So that's a huge question, Frank. I think there's several layers to your question. I'll just offer a couple of observations. One is that I think that we are incredibly privileged and blessed to have the opportunities that we have in the United States, as well as the opportunities we had in India, the formative years, the education, the family support, and so on, to make us who we are today. And I think it behooves us to think about how we best give back, whether it's money or time or other forms of resources, social capital to help others. So that's the first. The second, I would say, is understanding the context in which we are embedded in the United States. Yes, this is a nation of immigrants, but it is also a country that was built on the land of Native Americans, the labor of African Americans. So understanding that context in which we are operating and reflecting on that and engaging with that to better support racial justice struggles here is very, very important. And then staying connected with India, of course, or our countries of origin. But I tend to think of myself in a global way, where I am deeply committed to and engaged with India, and my entire family's there. But I'm also concerned with issues around the world. I'm concerned with the treatment of Haitian refugees on the US-Mexico border. I am concerned with the plight of...
The way they were treated, that's unacceptable.
Yes, I'm concerned with the plight of people in Afghanistan. I'm concerned with the plight of people in Myanmar. And so I think we need to really think about these issues from a perspective of shared humanity.
Very well said. It's America that provided all of us the letters. And those are the qualities of America that all of us can proudly and truly embrace, which does not exist anywhere in the world that I know of. Would you agree with me?
I think that's hard for me to answer because I tend to not fall into the dogma of American exceptionalism. I try to think about each society goes through different phases.
Yeah.
And, in fact, many of the countries that we call countries today did not exist on a map 100 years ago. And so I think of the overarching sweep of history. I think about the ways in which we connect with each other as humans. And I think about the shared values that we would like to uplift amongst everyone.
Very well said. And I would also say that my story can only happen in America, nowhere else. So thank you very much, Sushma, for coming. This is Frank Islam, wishing you a great week, and thank you for watching.